the empire, Russian Empire expanded and occupied 1867, I think. That's the year when the empire, like a bubble, spread around from Finland to Alaska. Okay, and pretty much the job of expansion was completed by 1880s. 1880s. Okay. So today we're going to discuss what was done in terms of this territorial expansion. New areas were attached. First, as a result of the wars against Napoleon, okay, then as a result of expansion to Siberia and beyond, because we talked about Siberia and you probably remember what actually prompted the Russians to expand beyond Siberia. I might ask you this question. I did mention it once. And then expansion to Central Asia, okay, then expansion to Caucasus Mountains, and also expansion to Southeastern Europe, okay, plus existence of a huge area called Pale, okay, that's what I'm going to mention, which means a Jewish segment of the population, okay. So all these things we're going to discuss, basically how Russian Empire became so multi-ethnic that it was hard to control this empire. Okay, at some point, the Russian government decided to get rid of some of these lands. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. So these are the areas we're going to briefly discuss. Some of them we did mention, okay, because we couldn't skip them. But we discussed the expansion to Siberia when Russia absorbed Mongol words. Again, it's a Freudian slip. Because Russia did assimilate Mongol words, Mongol lands. Okay? And the Mongol lands absorbed by Russia were these areas. Okay? Western Siberia, Western Siberia. But these areas were not Mongol. Okay? These were independent areas, not settled by Europeans. Okay? And Russia completed the job of expansion by the time when Peter the Great died, 1725. Okay. So here we're going to discuss this area. It was a new acquisition in the 19th century. This area in Central Asia, okay, was not originally part of the Russian Empire. Muslim areas. Okay. These are the Buddhist areas. Caucasus Mountains. For the first time, Russia expanded since the beginning of the 19th century into Caucasus Mountains, acquired these areas. And finally, the completion of finishing of Poland, so-called Duchy of Warsaw. Remember we talked about, anyway, we will talk about these things, I just don't want to jump ahead. So let's talk first about Europe. In Europe, the biggest acquisition was Finland, 1809. Okay, 1809. And the empire had to compromise here because Sweden was a constitutional monarchy, and it was hard to compete with the constitutional monarchy. So Russian Emperor Alexander I had to give something to the Finnish people, and we did talk about it. So he gave them the constitution, and the Finnish people became very loyal. In fact, Finnish people became the famous navigators, so who staffed a military fleet. Okay, if you look at the names of the famous Russian navigators who went overseas, okay, providing help in Russian expansion overseas, many of these people are navigators who were experienced in seafarers, so experienced in navigating Baltic Sea. Plus, Finland didn't have serfdom, so any Finnish person could be recruited to perform the job of a craftsman, a military man, a merchant. So they were used by Russia to kind of enter Europe. Okay. As I told you, Finland at some point had her own currency, her own troops. Okay. And the parliament that allowed all males rich and poor to vote, okay, which was very unusual, I repeat. Which later, I repeat, opened, I'm jumping ahead, this wide existence of this wide rights for males eventually prompted Finland to become the first country in the world that enfranchised the female segment of the population, 1906. Okay. A little known area which is normally skipped in the books is Bessarabia, so-called Bessarabia. It's essentially Romanians. You heard about Romania country, everybody knows where Romania is, a similar language, okay? But Russia took over this area, and the local people were happy to become part of the Russian Empire because Romanians were and are Greek Orthodox, okay? Greek Orthodox. So Russia, as a result of the war with Turkey, 1806, 1812, it's a marginal war. We didn't mention it because the major obsession of Alexander I was Napoleon. But there was this marginal war as a result of which part of what today we call Romania, Bessarabia, became part of the Russian Empire. And the Ottoman Empire territory was shrinking gradually. Okay. Finally, Poland lost all her independence completely. Originally, when under Catherine the Great, this area of Eastern Poland was included in the Russian Empire. Remember we talked about partitioning of Poland. Catherine the Great did maintain particular rights for ducal warfare. So this small principality enjoyed limited self-government. At some point they had constitution, okay? And at first Alexander I recognized this constitution, okay? They had wide rights. They had their postal service. They had limited military force, okay? But since they sided with Napoleon, remember, Poland, Polish troops joined Napoleon by invading Russia. So this small area in Eastern Poland, okay? This was Eastern Poland. But within Eastern Poland, surrounding area didn't have any autonomy. But within Eastern Poland, there was duchy warfare that did maintain some local autonomy. So as a result of this war with Napoleon, the duchy warfare was attached to the Russian Empire, and eventually the Polish people lost here all their rights. Okay, by 1830s, they lost many rights and eventually lost the constitution. As I said, Russian imperial government successfully used Baltic German element in diplomacy, in secret police service, in the military. Okay. It was very, very successful policy. Historian, what's his name? Benedict Anderson, I think, calls this use of ethnic minority for promoting foreign interests, diplomatic gains, a mobilized diaspora. Mobilized diaspora. That's an expression introduced by this historian, mobilized diaspora. In human history, you know examples of mobilized diaspora. For instance, in China, they use so-called huaqiao. It's overseas Chinese people who became experienced merchants. Okay, China was still using them to promote her interests in the United States and Australia, for instance, to the present day diaspora. Sometimes an alien diaspora is used. For example, Ottoman Empire used Greek and Armenian diplomats, scribes, and merchants to promote her interests. Okay, Russia used the German, Baltic German elements, since they were open to Europe, and the goal of Russia was to promote her interest in Europe. So they became these kind of mediators, cultural brokers. Okay, that's another expression historians love to use. Cultural brokers, I guess. Because it was hard for many ethnic Russians to kind of squeeze themselves into Europe. Although by the middle of the 19th century, I repeat, the Russian aristocracy, which assimilated for French and German language and became heavily Europeanized and married into Baltic German clans, okay, became mixed aristocracy. For these German elements, it was allowed to practice their own religion, so they were mostly Lutherans. Okay. Last time, during our last conversation last week, I mentioned that the chief of the secret police under Nicholas II, or Nicholas I, who took over in 1825 after the Decembrists revolted, okay, against the empire. He was a Baltic German, very efficient, organized a very efficient secret police, okay, top civil servants, and so forth and so forth. See, it was religious tolerance. The Russian elite was multinational. There were also some Tatars, but Tatars were used to promote Russia's interest in the East, okay. So Tatar elite that was incorporated in the Russian Empire, they were Muslims. So they were used as cultural brokers to build the bridges with Central Asia. Okay, so in addition to this, let's write Tartar segment used as cultural brokers with the East. Okay. Some of these people, Germans, Baltic Germans, and some Tatars eventually converted to Russian Orthodoxy, but not many, because they were able to maintain their religion, and until 1850s, religious tolerance was very much the policy of the empire. Okay, but last time I mentioned something. What did we mention last? What did we talk about?
Autocracy, Russian Orthodoxy, and to Russify, to unify the empire. Orthodoxy was one of the principles of unity in the empire.
Yes, yes. There was something toxic that was injected in the Russian Empire. Okay. Little did they know, people in the court, that eventually it would undermine the empire. Huh? But because some of the Russian ethnic element that became more educated, that assimilated all these European ways, European knowledge, they felt cheated. They wanted to have more voice for themselves, more empower themselves, as a pardon my fancy word. It's a very popular, people love to use it, empower. So they wanted to empower themselves. And Nicholas I gradually, not overnight, gradually started to peddle this Russian nationalism, okay, which by 1900 started to erode the empire. Okay, because the power of the empire was this tolerance of different religions. Okay, the major loyalty was to the personality of the emperor. Okay, and the nationalism was not visible in the Russian Empire. Local nationalism did not exist until the end of the 19th century. Later we will be talking about it. But at this point, even by the middle of the 19th century, when this toxic ideology was injected, again, the name of this toxic ideology was official nationality, theory or ideology, official nationality, which had three elements. Okay, autocracy, right?
Right, Russian Orthodoxy.
Russian Orthodoxy.
And Russian. You had to be an ethnic Russian. So the Ukrainians were really not Ukrainians. They were little Russians, and they spoke a dialect of Russian.
Yeah. See, in these three elements, only the first resonated with the foundational principle of the empire, tolerance. The other two did not resonate with the tolerance that had existed before the middle of the 1900s. Okay, autocracy was the cornerstone of this empire. So the empire, the personality of the emperor. But now the court injected this two more elements that Russian Orthodox Church. So we have to promote Russian Orthodox Church as the major organizing principle of the empire, which already set the empire for trouble. Okay, because half of the Russian elite preach different things, Islam and especially Lutherans. And the third element was the most toxic element. It's a gradual assimilation of imperial borderlands into Russia proper, okay? Russianizing them. Okay.
You said that Ukraine, if I remember correctly, meant margin?
Margin, yeah. Ukraine means area on the margins, in literal translation. The word Ukraine means area located on the margins, which is correct because it was a marginal borderland, right? By the way, this expression that by the end of the 19th century became popular in the Russian discourse among Russian intelligentsia about what today we call Ukraine, Southern Russia. They were called Little Russians. Already shows a diminishing attitude to the second major segment of the empire, the Kazakhs and those Southern Russians that eventually became Ukrainians. Because at first they were separate ethnographic group, and eventually they developed a separate identity. As a result of absorption of Poland, I just mentioned Poland was absorbed in the Russian Empire. A large segment of the new population was included in the Russian Empire, Jewish people. So Russia became the #1 country with the major segment of the Jewish population. So most of the Jews now live in the Russian Empire. Okay. 60% of all Jews of the world now live in the Russian Empire because of this Polish area, and Bessarabia, which I just mentioned, part of Romania, also were attached. And an interesting administrative rule was introduced for this area. Russian government, not under Catherine, but as of the reign of Nicholas I, remember, who was a conservative czar, who tried to crack down not only on the Russian aristocrats who wanted to introduce constitutional monarchy, but Nicholas I was in general conservative, so he wanted to impose censorship, suffocate his liberal notions. So part of this conservative policies was creation of so-called Pale, Jewish Pale. Okay. Jewish Pale, it's a reservation. You're familiar with this, the Indian reservation. In, for example, in U.S. Before 1924, before Native Americans became American citizens, Indians were not allowed beyond the reservational borders. Okay, something like this existed for Jews within the Russian Empire. They were not allowed beyond particular administrative borders. Okay, Nicholas I defined the borders and the Jews were allowed to congregate only within the territory of what was the Polish Commonwealth, or at least part of the Polish Commonwealth, because a chunk of Polish Commonwealth was occupied by Austria-Hungary, and western part was occupied by Prussia, but eastern part was occupied by Russia. Why did they do this? Because there was a fear of a Jewish commercial entrepreneurship. Okay? Because you heard about this expression, Jewish professions. You heard this? Who will explain to me what does it mean, Jewish professions? It's a historical metaphor, if you wish, but it has something behind this, you know, there's
Like
something.
Professions dealing with money, like accountants and stuff.
It's a part of the answer. By the way, it's a correct answer, but part of the answer. Okay, good, thank you. So let's kind of build on this.
So basically, because usury was a sin in Catholic Church,
Mm-hmm.
the lending of
And
money.
the Greek Orthodox too.
Okay.
And the Greek Orthodox.
Right, so the only way you could charge interest was to commit a sin. So since it wasn't a problem for the Jews, right, they became the bankers,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then they got involved lending money, so they were constantly with merchants. And they became small merchants, but they also became big bankers like the Rothschilds,
Mm-hmm.
to use a very famous example.
Mm-hmm.
So, but they were very skilled with commerce,
Mm-hmm.
and they were tinkers. They would be traveling around. They had these different skill sets that were forbidden to a lot of Christians.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, absolutely right. You wanted to say something too, or okay? Again, it's an 80% of the answer. Let me add something, but you almost answered the question. It covered what you just said, so-called Jewish professions. It concerned not only commercial activities, not only financial activities. It also concerned such professions as dentists, scribes, interpreters, okay? Occasionally diplomats, managers, like in Polish Commonwealth, the Jews managed land estates of Polish aristocrats, okay? But again, mostly what you said, these were so-called Jewish professions, as a financial and commercial activities, which were forbidden for Catholic Christians in Europe, okay, and for Orthodox as well, okay. But how did it come in the first place? In the first place, if you studied history when a Jewish diaspora emerged, Jews were forbidden in early Middle Ages as well, were forbidden to buy land. They were forbidden to buy cows. They were forbidden to practice agriculture. Okay? That became the established tradition. So for people to kind of survive, they had to enter particular professions, and they excelled in these professions. What you just mentioned, and you mentioned the same thing. So that's what made so-called Jewish professions. Okay. So when Europe entered the stage of modern life, or as Marxists would say, capitalism. So they became very kind of, it became very handy to have them, because they already had mastered all the skills that were needed in the modern time. Okay. But there was, of course, another group of people who similarly almost mastered the same skills, were Northern Europeans, who also were taught by Protestant religion that on a limited scale usury was good. Remember debates, if you studied European history, debates in Geneva, Swiss city, debates that were conducted by John Calvin, one of the Protestant theologians. What usury was to be allowed. So eventually the debate was about how much interest you should charge to be on the good side. So, and I don't remember exact number, but John Calvin said, if you charge like 10% interest, so you're evil, you're not Christian. But if you charge 3% interest, so you're on the good side. Okay. Which is bizarre, of course. It was an attempt to bypass these requirements, theological requirements, okay? So there were two elements in Europe that had existed to jumpstart this commercial activities: the Jewish segment and Protestant segment. Okay, but see, even Protestant segment was not totally open to these commercial activities. That's a little bit open. Anyway, in the Polish Commonwealth, Jews were successful merchants, successful managers. A bunch of stores were opened and owned by Jews, including what we would call saloons, bars. I don't know what was the name at that time for these places. So, and since the culture of drinking was very popular in the Russian segment, okay, the fear of the Russian government, imperial government, was that Jews would drink to death. The Russians. That was the official explanation why they needed to create this reservation. Of course, it's a stereotype, because Jews, I repeat, 80% of them were employed in other occupations. But in all fairness, the major bulk of Jews were small peddlers, craftsmen, okay? But it was fact that they didn't practice agriculture. It was fact. So in all these areas, 800,000 Jews was a lot of. It's a huge segment. By the way, by 1900, it was already 2 million people. Okay, so it was a huge segment of population. So, according to requests, in answering requests of Russian, Ukrainian merchants, primarily merchants, and Baltic German aristocrats, Russian aristocrats, who were petrified of this invasion because they were afraid they had to compete with them. Okay, when you, for instance, if you put myself in charge of some kind of grocery store, I will probably ruin this grocery store because I had no experience. Yeah? I'm a salaried guy, you know. I'm kind of using my tongue and my pen, you know, my computer to write things, you know. But if you put yourself in the shoes of a Russian aristocrat, who will probably, especially after Catherine the Great allowed the aristocrats not to serve, you know. Aristocrat who could start his day, you know, by just laying in the bed, you know, having coffee and waking up at 1 p.m. or something like this. And suddenly they had to compete with energetic people, enterprising people. You understand it, so you will be petrified. So to kind of suffocate entrepreneurship of this segment, rules were introduced, very simple and brutal rules that Jews were not allowed to live in big Russian and Ukrainian cities, such as Moscow, St. Petersburg. Okay. There was an exception for this rule, so Jews had to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. Okay. If Jewish merchants wanted to move, but it was very hard to do, very hard. Even in this case, there was a lot of discrimination because they couldn't be elected in local self-government that eventually was introduced in Russian cities in the second half of the 19th century. Okay. They couldn't join guilds of merchants. They were allowed to live, reside in particular cities if they converted to Russian Orthodoxy, but they were still denied a lot of rights. Another thing, Jews were not allowed to enter universities, okay, because Jews had a huge number of educated people. Okay, it was part of the Jewish tradition to give education to boys and girls. Okay, for example, compared to Ukrainian and Russian peasants and other indigenous people of the Russian Empire, the Jewish people in this area, Pale, had so-called cheder. Cheder, it's religious elementary school. Elementary school. Okay, it's a 5 years of schooling where boys and girls were taught Talmud. You heard of Talmud? It's one of the founders. Let me describe it in a simple way. It's a traditional Jewish law, so to speak. Traditional Jewish, a set of behavioral rules you have to follow in order to be a good Jew. Okay. Religious, moral prescriptions. Okay. But in addition, to teaching this set of rules, boys and girls were taught how to read and to write. Okay. They were taught how to work with books. And you heard about this expression that Jews sometimes are called people of the book, right? It's a metaphor because they were people of the Bible. And the metaphor also for to describe the craving for knowledge that traditionally was and still is popular among the Jews, if compared to other cultures. For example, Russian culture, Russian peasant culture, where traditionally they had appreciated manual labor, peasant labor, working on the land, because that was this legacy of the servant, okay, that existed in Russian culture and Ukrainian culture partially. Although Ukraine had this Kazakh tradition, more individualistic. So had a religious education. In Russia, until the end of the 19th century, there were no village schools. Peasants were totally illiterate, okay? Unlike the Jewish segment. The only segment of the population that successfully could compete with Jews is Baltic Germans. Baltic Germans. But Baltic Germans were a small group of aristocrats, remember, who exploited indigenous people in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Okay. So it's a tiny minority. Okay. In terms of numbers, Jews, so-called common people, among Jews, even poor people were educated. Okay. So that was the fear of the Russian government. They could send a lot of people, and they could staff all the universities. Okay.
Were they totally excluded, or did they just have a percentage?
Later, it was done like this, second half of 19th century. When Jews converted to Russian Orthodoxy, they could enter the universities after they passed an exam, because you know, unlike US, where anybody could be in university with any kind of grades. It's another story that only 40% of people graduate. In European universities, there's another tradition. People, before they admitted to universities, they have to pass entrance exams, and it's very competitive, you know. Each European university to the present day, it's like Harvard and Yale, where like 6 or 7 candidates for each opening, okay? So it's not for everybody, especially at that time. So Jews were allowed to enter the universities, they were allowed to to take exams, okay, if they converted to Russian Orthodoxy. But at the same time, the fear was still there that a lot of Jews might flood the universities. So a percentage was introduced. So the percentage varied. It was like 1%, 1.5%. In the second half of the 19th century, Jews were allowed to be in Russian universities. Okay. Basically, the imperial government wanted to keep. It was a sort of affirmative action. They said, okay, look, the Jews were, let's say, 1.5% of the population of the Russian Empire. It means that 1.5% should be at Russian imperial universities. You know? That's how many Jews should be. Okay, that's how the game was played, you know, just to make it clear. And by the way, jumping ahead, this game in percentage was still unofficially survived 1970. Even though originally, after communism came to Russia, everything was open for everybody. But later, the Soviet government introduced the same percentage. It was not written in stone because it was forbidden to talk about it. But unofficially, it was practiced. Like I felt it. I don't want to say I'm a victim, you know, but I felt on my own skin when I had to enter Soviet University, I passed exams and I passed them well in 1978. But I wasn't admitted, and my mother later learned through friends that they thought I was a Jew because my last name ended with SKI. Because many Jews had these last names because they came from Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And you know, Polish names end with SKI. And then later they apologized. They said, oh, we made a mistake, so let him enter the extramural department, so later we will shift him to a regular university. So, but it was really kind of weird for me. That's when I started to go, what's going on? But it wasn't official. Okay. Here we're talking about the time when it was written down. Okay. There was a set of documents about Jews, how they should reside, where they should reside, a lot of rules. Okay. By the way, now you understand why later Jews became so active in the Communist Revolution, 1917, because they harbored a big grudge. I would have felt the same. Yeah, if you put yourself in the shoes of the people who were like, the wings were clipped. They were not allowed to spread the wings. Okay, so now we're kind of switching from Europe to Siberia. Okay. We know, we talked about Ivan the Terrible, then under Peter the Great, the Kazakhs extended to Siberia. And what was the major financial interest here for the Russians to expand to Siberia? What did they want to do?
Furs.
Furs, yeah, furs. Sable furs. Okay. But then they went further. They were not satisfied at some point by the beginning of the 1700s. They wanted to go beyond Siberia. What? Do you remember? Do you remember? I did mention this. So what happened?
Bering found the straits, and they started colonizing Alaska.
That's true. Mm-hmm. But what pushed them? Because Alaska is not exactly, southwestern Alaska has a favorable climate, but central northern Alaska is not exactly a good place to live. But they wanted to go there. What prompted them to go there? Mm-hmm.
Didn't they push the animals that were getting the first from to extinction?
Yes, that's the answer. Sables were almost all wiped out. By the beginning of the 1700s, sables were literally destroyed in Siberia because the major form of tribute payment on the part of indigenous Siberians was furs. And the sables were the most popular way to pay tribute. Okay. If one indigenous native could kill 5 sables, it could be his tribute, either quarterly tribute, or don't remember exactly how often they had to show up to give this tribute in kind. Okay. So instead of killing 100 deers and providing these furs, and a native could kill like 5 or 6 sables and quickly pay. So because the sable furs were the most precious thing. Okay. That was the hard currency, Russia's hard currency at that time. So almost all population of sables was wiped out, and the Russians wanted to move beyond the Siberia to get something. And this something, I will mention it, so let me interrupt you. Let's finish with Siberia first. Okay. Before we talk about Alaska, which is an interesting case, we are going to finish our conversation about Siberia. Okay. Admiral with this long name, Muravyev-Amursky, a governor of Eastern Siberia, was an expansionist, and he decided to take advantage on his own. To take advantage of the Second Opium War and seized a lot of fertile lands in the basin of Amur River. What is the Opium War? Do you remember? Did we talk about it or not? Who will remind me? See, I'm trying to use your knowledge of world history. Who else? You play, yeah, let me shut you. First time, I'm just kidding. Because you're the most active student. I'm trying to give a voice. I'm trying to empower everybody. Okay, who else? Anybody else? Okay, go ahead.
Slightly spotty because like, isn't the Opium Wars related to like the really strained relations between the British and Chinese? I thought. Yeah, like
What happened?
the basis I know for like the wars is that like Britain basically flooded China with opioids because like the Chinese, because the Chinese were refusing to give like more power to the British. Or the resources that the British were demanding.
China like outlawed opium, right? And then Britain kept trying to push it in because they were making a lot of money off of it.
Yeah, that's true. But why did they try to push it so hard? Suddenly.
Because they took over lands in India, which, you know, wasn't really good for growing like what they planned to grow there, which is like tea or cotton or whatever. But it turned out it worked really well for opium. And given that there was a huge trade deficit with China on account of its closed off nature, like the British economy was literally running out of money because of all the money they were pouring into trade with China. So for them, like opium was a way to get some of that back. And, you know, the Chinese naturally objected to a foreign power pumping in loads of cheap drugs on their population, so they tried to clamp it off. And then, you know, as I said, like, the British objected to that, and, you know...
Thank you. Everything is correct. But there was a second reason why Britain pushed so hard. You are correct. That's a first. The second reason. Do you remember?
The ports in China were closed to the British.
That's the answer. That's the answer. Okay. So Britain wanted to crack open China for foreign trade, and Chinese were saying, no, you're barbarians, we don't want to trade with you, we're going to keep them closed, it's up to us. Literally, they shut down the foreign trade, but Britain wanted all coastal cities to be open for foreign trade. So that was the second reason, in addition to what you said. So eventually, what happened, Britain attacked China. There were two opium wars. The first started, as far as I remember, 1836, I think. There was a second one, and China, of course, was defeated because it didn't have modern military industry and all that. They still used pikes, bows, arrows. Okay, they didn't have enough cannons, muskets, so they were defeated. But the attack on China became so attractive to other European nations that France joined the game. France joined the English, and they also occupied a few coastal cities. Then the Americans joined. Americans joined. And Russia also jumped on the bandwagon. Okay? So Russia took advantage of the situation. This guy, whose portrait is here, expansionist, okay, die-hard expansion, he had a military officer who, on his own, went to, that's the area that Russia sees, before it belonged to China, okay? This guy, expansionist, he had a military officer who sailed to Sakhalin Island, explored this area, and wherever he went, he stuck a Russian flag, okay? And originally, local bureaucrats, they tried to reprimand him. One military bureaucrat even tried to court-martial him because these areas were officially belonging to China, and they were colored in Chinese colors on maps. Maps existed in China, okay? But Nicholas I endorsed this seizure. He said, wherever Russian flag is planted, it shall never go down. That was his phrase, you know, so he endorsed this expansion. And that's how the whole area was occupied. And why was so much fuss about this big area? This area, because that was the fertile soil here. Unlike the rest of Siberia, where not enough fertile soil exists. Here, no fertile soil. The only hunting you can practice. This area had mild climate and you can practice agriculture here. So that is why Russians wanted to seize this area. So to the present day, it's one of this kind of objects of discontent. You know, right now, of course, Russia and China are friends. They are befriending each other against Americans. That's the basis, the foundation of Russo-Chinese friendship right now. But even though they have close relationships right now, still this area is still a kind of hot spot because it officially had belonged to China. The Russians seized it. Okay. Okay, so now let's say a few words about Alaska. I want to go back to what you just mentioned. When sable population was depleted in Siberia, so Russians discovered naturally sea otters. Sea otters. Sea otters are the sea animals who also have precious fur. And their furs were valuable, equally as sables. Okay? At first, some Kazakhs, then Russian companies commissioned by local bureaucrats discovered parts of Alaska, penetrated it, occasionally were fighting against indigenous people here. But eventually, since everything was subjected to the governmental control in Russia, okay, unlike England or other countries, colonization was not to be a private enterprise. Everything had to be controlled by the government. It was governmentally sponsored colonization. So Russian government created this semi-private company called Russian American Company, okay, that has existed. It received its charter in 1799, started to work in 1800 and existed until 1867. And after 1867, when Alaska was sold to the United States, it still existed. It was relocated to Siberia. Russian American Company, it was government/private enterprise. Okay. The Tsar, Alexander I, the court people, these Baltic Germans, the Russian aristocrats, they were shareholders. But the shares were allowed for all other rich people. They were open to purchase by other people, so everybody who had money could buy shares of this company. But the control package belonged to the court. Okay.
So is this the flag of that company?
It's a flag of the company. So if you delete this eagle, so that's going to be a Russian flag. That's a Russian flag. Okay. But in Alaska, Russian American Company had its own flag with this double-headed eagle and Russian flag. Okay. And here you can read Russian American Company. Okay. It was a profitable enterprise. Okay. Because I repeat, furs were the staple product of the Russian foreign trade. Okay. Before, at the end of the 19th century, Russia started selling grain to foreign markets. So before Russia did it, furs were the major staple product for foreign trade. Okay. So it was the biggest company in the Russian Empire, controlled by the government. And Alaska received a peculiar status. So the company was the monopoly that had monopoly control of Alaskan population, indigenous people. Okay. Now, let's see if we have time or not. Because I can talk a lot about it. It's my... We still have time. Good. It's my specialty, actually, because as I said, I wrote a PhD dissertation on colonial Siberia and Alaska in 1990s, a long time ago, but still a lot of information. So it did not forget things yet. Now we have to talk about the status of Siberian and Alaskan natives. In Siberia, indigenous population lived according to Speransky code. Let me steal some dry marker tape. It was here somewhere. Did I put it somewhere? Oh, here we go. In Siberia, indigenous people lived according to this code. Remember Speransky, who originally was used by Alexander I to play constitutional games, you know? And when he felt, Alexander I, felt that the project of Speransky about bringing constitution to Russia went against interest of aristocracy, he ditched Speransky and appointed him the general governor of Western Siberia. So, and over there he developed this legal code for indigenous people in Siberia. So they were divided into three groups. Okay, settled natives, wandering nomadic natives, and wandering natives. Settled natives is primarily Buddhist areas in the southern Siberia where indigenous people practiced agriculture. So they had to pay tribute in money, not in kind. Nomadic natives, it's semi-settled people who had permanent residences in Siberia, but at the same time they were practicing forest hunting. So they had to deliver the tribute either in money or in furs at their own choice. Okay. And the third group, wandering natives, so totally nomadic population who were hunters and gatherers who were hunting sables, primarily, this group. So they were delivering tribute in kind, pelts, okay, in special collection points. So, and that was it. And they were not considered, they were considered like an alien element, hence the name of the code, Code of Aliens. So they were not totally observed in the Russian Empire. Okay. In Alaska, 1821, RAC rules. Russian-American Company, 1821, when the new charter of Russian-American Company was endorsed by the emperor. Indigenous natives of Alaska were similarly divided in three groups. You know, see, it's a legacy of Siberia. Only the words were different. Dependent natives, aleuts, mostly aleuts, Aleutian Islands. Third, semi-dependent, some Athabascan Indians, some of whom were dependent, some inland natives of Alaska were independent Athabascans. And independent, like Tlingit Indians. It's example, Tlingit. There was no tribute in Alaska. There was no tribute. Why? Because dependent nations were forced to work for Russian-American company. Remember, Russia was practicing serfdom. So coastal populations of Alaska became serfs who were obligated to work for Russian-American company. Okay? So they were put in kayaks and were forced to go and hunt the sea otters or other fur animals. Okay? Semi-dependent, some of them were forced to do the work for Russian-American companies. Some of them could not be forced because they were so far away, Russians couldn't reach them. In fact, the total, quote unquote, Russian population of Alaska was over 800. It never exceeded 800, yeah. Which is very embarrassing for present-day Russian nationalists who speak and talk a lot about Alaska, because Alaska is an interesting tool current Russian nationalists use in their anti-American propaganda. They say, oh, it was a Russian land covered with Russian blood and sweat. It should belong to the Russians. Then, yeah, on TV shows, Putin, for instance, 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine, he had this press conference that was televised all over Russia, and one of their listeners asked, Mr. Putin, when are we going to get back Alaska? It's already time. So it's part of the Russian populace, so-called common people believe into this thing. So anyway, coastal areas were turned into serfdom population areas. So local natives became serfs. Independent natives were independent tribes who ignored Russian presence, like Tlingit Indians or inland people who lived in inland Alaska. Okay. The name of the person who was the first chief of the Russian-American company was Alexander Baranov. So he was the person who shaped this enterprise, presided over this project. That's the map. The capital of Russian America was the so-called New Archangel. Right now it's Sitka. You heard about Sitka? Sitka. It's you heard. Have you been there? Who was at Sitka? It's a small,
They're all
small town.
towns,
Yes?
yeah.
Small town.
But there's a Russian Orthodox church there.
Yeah, yeah. Ironically, the most fierce group of people who contested Russian presence were Tlingit Indians who lived 1 mile away from the capital of Russian America. So Russians were not able to subdue them. Okay. So constant wars, constant wars. So New Archangel was a fort, and Tlingit Indians constantly challenged Russians. So. By the way, Tlingit Indians were notorious slaveholders. They were raiding neighboring tribes, Aleuts, the serfs who worked for Russian American companies, seized people, enslaved them. And if you know, the last slave to be liberated on US soil was a Tlingit Indian slave. He was liberated by US Marshal in 1910. Okay. Interesting, because sometimes when we talk about the last slaves to be liberated, we are talking about continental states. No, it happened in Alaska in 1910. Because slavery became part of the traditional culture. And when the Russians, in fact, when the Russians confronted them, but Russians confronted them not about the slave trade, because Russia herself practiced serfdom. What Russian governments had problem with when Tlingit Indians killed their slaves during tribal feasts. Tlingit Indians had the tradition, so-called giveaway ceremony. Rich people among Tlingit Indians, to show off that they're important, powerful. During feasts, they stabbed the slaves to show the despise for their wealth. They burned the blankets, they destroyed piles of meat, killed the slaves to show how they despise their wealth. So I'm so rich, I can dispose my wealth. And that's what the Russians were against. They said, why do you kill your slaves? And some Tlingit chiefs said, okay, we can give you some of these slaves. So and eventually some of these slaves were sent to the Russian capital. Okay. Interesting tradition. The major problem for this colony, Russian colony, was how to supply this area. Because you cannot travel through Siberia. It took you like 2 months or maybe more. The roads were bad, forests, forget about supply. You can start, you can leave St. Petersburg and you might disappear. You might be killed on the way. Huh? But anyway, all supplies were delivered by around the world travelers. Okay? These Baltic Germans and Finnish people who were major navigators, Finnish people primarily, they became captains who were in charge of supply boats who were traveling from St. Petersburg to Alaska. Okay? Constantly, each year, Russian government sent an expedition with a lot of supplies and some kind of Indian goods to be sold to Indians or to other indigenous people like Aleuts. And it was the problems. Major problem how to provide food supplies. So Russians, you know, are bread eaters. You know, the bread is the major staple diet. So Alexander Baranov sends a boat to California, and he sets in 1812 Fort Ross. It's in California. Again, I told you about this in the beginning of the semester. North of San Francisco, how many miles? 35 miles, yeah? Away north of San Francisco, there is a port, Fort Ross, highway number 1. If you're in California, so nice travel. It's a beautiful area. That's where Russians were supposed to plant the crops or buy the grain from local Spaniards. In fact, it was officially part of the Spanish Empire, but Russians ignored it, invaded this area, concluded a treaty with local Indians, Native Americans, and just when Spaniards came, they said, get out, you know. And that's how life was at that time. Eventually, it became more profitable for the Russians to buy grain supplies from American boats who came straight to Sitka and sold grain directly to Russian storages here. So they decided to shut down Fort Ross because it was expensive to hold this colony, and it was sold to Swiss adventurer William Zatter. William Zatter, we talked about him, I mentioned. And a few years later, William Zatter lost everything because California gold rush started and there was a huge stampede. So people literally destroyed Fort Ross. You know, the surrounding areas. Everything was mined, was dug out. Thousands of miners came here in 1849. So Russians disappeared just in time. Okay, just in time. At some point, Hawaii Islands were also seized by Russians. In 1830s, a Baltic German, Dr. Scheffer, with a small crew of Russian navigators, invaded Hawaii Islands and stuck the Russian flag and declared Hawaii Russian territory. But he wasn't successful because local natives revolted against this. Then the Americans came, so it was just a grand adventure that failed. You know, Alaska eventually was sold to the United States in 1867. American Congress didn't want to buy Alaska. Russia, it became so expensive when the population of sea otters started to disappear. It became very expensive to hold this colony, to supply this colony. And the Russian-American company had to be subsidized by the government. Okay? Eventually, they had to switch their tea trade. They started to go back to Siberia and trying to buy tea from China and sell it to Siberians. Okay? But sea otters was the major goal, so they're very expensive to hold this territory. So Russian government decided to sell it. They had to bribe people from U.S. Congress in order to force U.S. Congress to buy this colony. Okay, let's go back in the remaining time. Let's go back to, I wouldn't say Europe, to Southern Europe and Middle East. Okay. Another major object of expansion was Caucasus Mountain area, which was not before an object of expansion. So Russia, as a result of a war with Persia, another declining empire that was losing to European nations. It lost a war to Russia, and Russia seized this area. See? Yeah. At first, Georgia joined the Russian Empire because Georgia practiced Greek Orthodox Church. It was easy for them to join the Russian Empire to defend herself against Persia, Muslim Empire. That was the major goal of Georgians. Right now, you know, Georgia is an independent country. But Persia didn't like this union, and there was a war over this area, Caucasus Mountains. As a result of this war, Dagestan, Azerbaijan, and a part of northern Armenia were attached to Russia. Armenia was a Greek Orthodox country. In fact, Armenian Christianity was more ancient than Russian Christianity, and Byzantine Christianity more ancient than Byzantine Christianity. It goes almost to biblical times. So Armenia joined the Russian Empire in order to protect herself against Persia. Azerbaijan was a Muslim area that was seized by Russia, and of course it became again the object of this discontent later in the 20th century between Iran and Russia. And also a few areas which were die-hard Muslim areas were also included in the Russian Empire. One of these areas was Chechnya. Chechnya, right in the center of Caucasus. Chechnya was a die-hard Islamic area where elite belonged to millenarian Islamic sect called Murids were, they believed in jihad and all this stuff to maintain Islam in this pristine quality, okay, to fight the war against infidels. And here Russian colonizers come, and that's what started the long time war. Long after Armenia, Georgia, and even more than Azerbaijan became part of the Russian Empire, the war in Chechnya, Chechens against the Russians continued, started in the 1830s and continued well into the 1870s. Long time wars, Russo-Chechen wars. So now you understand why Chechnya to the present day harbors so many anti-Russian sentiments, because Russia tried to colonize Chechnya, kept sending troops here, and unable to defeat this small nation. Eventually, the chief of Chechen people, prophet named Shamil, S-H-M-I-L, Shamil the prophet. He was like a religious prophet who was in charge of this war against these Russian infidels. He was abducted, arrested, and forced to live under house arrest. That's when the resistance was partially subdued, and Chechnya became part of the Russian Empire. But it was not a gain, it was actually a Pyrrhic victory, because the population formally accepted Russian rule but disagreed with this and kept revolting. Finally, and here we need to finish our story in a few minutes. The biggest acquisition was Turkestan. We didn't talk about what happened with Russia in the second half of the 19th century. So it will be a topic of our next conversation. But jumping ahead, I want to tell you that in the second half of the 19th century, Russia was being industrialized. Russia started building factories, textile factories. So Russia needed raw materials, and one of the major raw materials Russian industry needed cotton. So that's the cotton area. plus fertile lands in this area. So Russian troops invaded under Alexander von Kaufman, Russian general, invaded this area. And the area was the location of numerous independent Muslim kingdoms, Kakan, Khiva, Bukhara. These were independent states. And since the Russian army was better trained and better equipped, so during these years the whole area was subjugated and included into the Russian Empire under the name Turkestan. That was generic name. Now you know that's the location at the present time of different countries, okay, which did not exist at that time. These countries actually gradually emerged during the Russian domination and then during the Soviet domination. So there was no national psychology. People didn't think about themselves as nations. Okay? The major loyalty was to local emperors, Muslim emperors. But Russia seized the entire area. The second reason why Russia decided to seize this area was not only economic, to get cotton and to get fertile lands. The second goal was competition with England, because England seized India and England was expanding to Afghanistan. And Russia was afraid that England might seize this cotton area, so the Russians decided to be the first. It was the beginning of so-called Great Game, when the Russian Empire and British Empire were competing over Central Asia, who would dominate this area. So Russia was able to buy this huge chunk of territory. Okay. So on this note, let me finish the story because time is up. And the next time we're going to discuss what happened in Russia in the second half of the 19th century, which totally changed the life of the Russian Empire and forced the Russian Tsar to abolish serfdom. Okay. And don't forget, there might be a quiz next time, so please be ready. Quiz based on this, what we discussed today.
Have a great rest of the morning.
You as well, thank you. And all a good night.
Two typos.
Another type. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I knew that because my eye caught.
Type me out.
I knew you would come and approach me, but it's okay.
A little bit, I got a little sick.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's okay.
C-A-U-C.
Oh, I got it.
C-A.
Thank you for calling.
U. C-A-U-C-A. There's no U there.
Well, there should be something here.
A-U.
No?
No, there's an A, missing an A. C-A-U. Spell offices.
The mountains?
I still have a problem. I will, even if you tell me right now, I will not be able to spell it correct.
C-A.
It's a nightmare.
C-A.
C-A, okay.
Right?
Go ahead.
C-A-U-C-A-S-U-S.
Right. There's no C-A-U.
C-A-U.
C-A-A.
S-U-S.
U-S.
S.
No. Just one S.
S.
And there's
And a U.
There's a U and there's no E.
Focus.
And then the other mistake is back up. You wanted to say Eastern and you said Eastern.
Where is it?
Right there.
Right there.
Governor of Eastern Siberia.
Yeah.
That's funny. All right, thanks.
All right. See you Thursday.
See you Thursday.
We're going to get these ratings that have a little ahead of time.
Yeah, I will post them. I remember.
I have a